Good day. Today is Sunday, 5th October 2025, and as you can see, I am preparing to travel to Oxford to attend an event there, and I will be away for most of the day, and I will be coming back to London quite late. So this program is being made very early in the morning on Sunday, as I advised might be the case in my previous program. And that inevitably means that I'm not up to date. I'm not going to be up to date with much of the news that is taking place over the course of today. And inevitably, this is going to be a very much shorter video than the usual videos, for which, all of which, please accept my apologies. But anyway, let's nonetheless go ahead and discuss some important events. And today I'm going to focus on the military situation in Ukraine again, though I do want to briefly say that we've now had the results in the elections, the parliamentary elections in the Czech Republic. It looks like the former Prime Minister, Mr. Babiš, who is also an important businessman, has won the election. His political group has won, from what I can see, a decisive victory. There's been much discussion about how this is going to change the Czech policy towards the conflict in Ukraine. It may be the case that the new government will be less enthusiastic about supplying ammunition to Ukraine. The Czech Republic is a major producer of artillery shells and explosives and various other military goods. But I doubt that it is going to make a huge difference overall to the policies of the Czech Republic. And I've never got the impression at any point in his career that Mr. Babiš was truly pro-Russian or sympathetic to Russia, or was the sort of person who really wanted to get himself drawn into a major conflict with the authorities in Brussels. But anyway, for what it is worth, probably a lot for the people of the Czech Republic. There may be significant changes, but for the overall geopolitical international relations picture, I doubt that it is going to make a huge amount of difference. Elsewhere, the most important news, it seems to me, at least in terms of the conflict in Europe, is about the situation on the front lines in Ukraine. I say that there appear to be some moves in the Gaza conflict. There are reports, for example, that the Palestinian group Hamas is prepared to release all of the hostages that it controls, and that President Trump is trying now to get a ceasefire set up in Gaza. I'm still deeply skeptical that any of this is going to work. This Trump peace plan is going to work. In fact, I'm confident that it will not. And again, this is a topic that I will discuss in more detail when I get back to London in a further video. So let's focus instead on the military situation in Ukraine and what has been taking place there. And the first thing to say is that there has been another major drone and missile strike across Ukraine. In my program yesterday, I said that the Russians, over the course of the previous 24 hours, appeared to be focusing most of their attacks on the Ukrainian energy complex. And in fact, the Ukrainian authorities themselves are saying that this is the most devastating attack that the Ukrainian energy complex has experienced since 2022, at a time when the Russians were only just beginning the attacks on the Ukrainian energy system that have continued relentlessly since then. But this was an enormous attack, apparently the one that took place 2 days ago. And apparently there is a follow-up massive attack underway as I am making this program, though the details are very sketchy, and I will have to wait and see what it actually involves. What I will also say is that there has been a further change in the attacks that the Russians are now undertaking. They are, for the first time that I'm aware of since the start of this conflict, making a sustained attack, undertaking a sustained aerial offensive on the Ukrainian railway system. Now, I say that there has been, over the course of the last few hours, a certain amount of reporting in the West, in the British media, about Russian attacks, a Russian drone attack on a Ukrainian passenger train. And there is pictures of a fire on this train, apparently caused by a Russian drone. The Ukrainian media outlet Strana, which is based outside Ukraine and which is opposed to the Ukrainian government, but is nonetheless well informed and which is by no means pro-Russian, claims that this attack was not actually on a railway train at all, but on a nearby freight train, in which case the fire on the passenger train was presumably caused by falling debris or something of that kind. I'm not going to get into the details of this because I don't know. But the key thing here is that the Russians are now conducting aerial attacks on trains. They're conducting aerial attacks on the railway system and on trains. And of course, it is trains that the Ukraine relies upon mostly to move men and supplies around the various battlefields. Now, if the Russians are able, through their energy war, their attack on the Ukrainian energy system, and their attacks on the railway system, to bring the movement of men and supplies across Ukraine to a stop, then that is a tremendous crisis for Ukraine, probably a terminal crisis in terms of the war. Obviously, Ukraine cannot continue the war without supplies reaching the battlefronts, without reinforcements reaching the battlefronts, and without the ability to deploy and redeploy troops from one part of the front line to another. It would paralyze the Ukrainians in a way that has not been possible for the Russians at any point earlier in the war. In fact, I can remember back in 2022 when the Russians were conducting missile strikes at that time, exclusively missile strikes, that the head of Ukrainian Railways at this time was boasting, telling I believe it was the London Times, that the Ukrainians had the situation so much under control that despite heavy Russian missile attacks, the Russians had so far been unable to stop a single Ukrainian supply train from reaching its destination. Well, that was then, 3 years ago. Today, the situation looks different. But again, I don't have the full details, and I suspect that we've still got some way to go before this becomes a complete blockade of the railway system and of the transport system in general by the Russians. Bear in mind, however, that Geran drone production in Russia continues to increase. Missile production in Russia continues to increase. The Russian Air Force itself is now more active and is able to conduct airstrikes using precision-guided fab bombs across the front line, doing so against Ukrainian positions far closer to the front line than was ever previously the case. So things that in 2022 were impossible, like stopping the railway system completely, are now starting perhaps to become not just imaginable, but actually possible. If you are producing 1,000 Duran drones a day, as several Ukrainian commentators have said they expect the Russians to be able to do before the end of the year, then all sorts of things begin to become possible for you. You can conduct multiple targets. You can overwhelm whatever is left of the Ukrainian air defenses. You can inflict massive damage right across Ukraine to a level and a degree that was not possible before. And you can attack multiple targets, including the rail transportation system, to a depth and with an intensity that was not previously possible. So anyway, this major offensive in the sky continues to be underway, and it is now becoming a daily routine. And by the way, there's also been reports of more attacks on power supplies, and in particular a power unit, an energy complex in the town of Kramatorsk, the biggest and most important town in the Slavyansk-Kramatorsk-Konstantinovka conurbation. And it seems that much of northeast Ukraine, the area of Chernigov and Sumy, continues to be affected by severe power outages, and the full power in this territory has still not returned. And of course, there's a possibility of further Russian attacks over the next couple of days or even hours. Now, that's already very grim news for Ukraine, but information that's trickling through from the battlefronts suggests that the situation is actually much more serious now than it has been, arguably, at any point for Ukraine since the start of the special military operation. The 7th Corps of the Ukrainian army has now published an extremely pessimistic update about the situation in Pokrovsk. It speaks of the Ukrainian troops there having to consider their own safety, that for the commanders of the 7th Corps, the survival of Ukrainian troops is their priority. Well, it's good to hear some Ukrainian commanders say that. And they're also talking about their difficulty in holding on to positions. And interestingly, they're also casting doubt for the first time on the importance of Pokrovsk. They're starting to say that Pokrovsk maybe is not the most important place on the Ukrainian battle lines. After all, there are lots of other towns in Ukraine and all of that. You can withdraw from Pokrovsk and the war can go on. But of course it isn't really like that at all. And as I've discussed in many programs, if the Russians ever do capture Pokrovsk, or rather when they capture Pokrovsk, then the entire Ukrainian defense line along this line of towns, Slavyansk, Kramatorsk, Konstantinovka, and Pokrovsk, starts to crumble, because the Russians are at that point in a position, having captured Pokrovsk, not only to cut off supplies to the Ukrainian forces holding the other 3 towns from the south, but also to outflank the Ukrainian defenders in those 3 towns, and to begin a process of, I don't think it's an overstatement to say, encirclement, with perhaps the priority being to encircle the town of Konstantinovka, which is the southernmost of the 3 towns of Slavyansk, Kramatorsk and Konstantinovka, and where President Putin of Russia says fighting is already underway within the town limits. Anyway, the key thing to say is that when the Ukrainian military start talking about Pokrovsk in this way, when they talk about the importance of the survival of their men, and that, to me, strongly indicates that the situation in Pokrovsk is taking a critical turn, and that Pokrovsk, the Battle of Pokrovsk, is now at a critical point. Now, there is not very much in the way of visual confirmation of what is actually going on inside Pokrovsk. The Russian Defense Ministry is clearly imposing a tight control on information from within Pokrovsk. And so, by the way of the Ukrainians, we're not getting very much in the way of video footage. But as I have been pointing out for several days, weeks now, the outlets, the specifically privileged media outlets in Russia, like Radovka, have for some time been claiming major Russian advances inside Pokrovsk. There are claims now that several of the important high-rise micro-districts in southeastern Pokrovsk have either fallen or, perhaps more realistically, are in the process of doing so. And the latest claims appear to suggest that control of the whole of Pokrovsk, including these micro-districts south of the railway line, for the Russians is within reach. Now, that is not the end of the Battle of Pokrovsk. There is still a significant built-up area north of the railway lines, which the Russians would have to capture. And, of course, there's also the eastern suburb of Mirnograd as well, though there is said to be fighting underway there also. However, if all of Pokrovsk south of the railway line comes under Russian control, and if the Russians capture the industrial sectors area to the northwest of Pokrovsk, then, frankly, the Ukrainian defenders will lack operational space. They would risk very much finding themselves in a cauldron if they were to stay in Pokrovsk. And though it might not be the final and immediate collapse of Ukrainian defense in Pokrovsk, it's difficult to imagine that the battle would continue there for more than, well, a couple of weeks at most. So we are at a critical point in the Battle of Pokrovsk. I have been saying repeatedly that even as the Ukrainians talk up constantly the battle that has been taking place in the area of the Russian breakthrough northeast of Pokrovsk, in places like Zoloty Kolodyaz and Kucherov Yar and those sort of places, they have been providing no information about the much more important battle in Pokrovsk itself, and it looks as if General Syrskyi's various counterattacks around in the area of the Russian breakthrough northeast of Pokrovsk, what they have done is what the Russians presumably always intended. They've drawn away the best Ukrainian brigades away from the defense of Pokrovsk itself, exposing them to heavy attack by the Russians and to being ground down by the Russians northeast of Pokrovsk, even as the Russians have basically been given a clear road towards clearing Pokrovsk itself. It has been a terrible trade. Probably Syrskyi had no realistic choice than to try to block the Russians or to roll back the Russians in the area of the Russian breakthrough northeast of Pokrovsk. If the Russians had simply been left alone to consolidate there, it would have been too dangerous a crisis for the Ukrainians, and they could not ignore it. But Syrskyi and Zelensky are very much at fault, also it seems to me, for providing so much optimistic spin about what has been going on northeast of Pokrovsk with all of these counterattacks. And of course, if they have, as I absolutely believe, been giving false information to their American friends about the battle northeast of Pokrovsk, then they have been deceiving their American friends, and they have done something profoundly wrong indeed. So anyway, that is what I think is going on in the battle in Pokrovsk. It looks as if Pokrovsk, well, it's not about to fall, but the battle there has reached a critical point, and it looks as if the way for its capture for the Russians is now opening. Now, there are reports in the area of the breakthrough, which, by the way, the Russians and the Ukrainians both refer to as the Dobropilia direction, because the nearest big town to this area, other than Pokrovsk itself, is the town of Dobropilia. Anyway, there are reports that the Russians now are very much on the initiative, had the initiative again, specifically in this area. And there were reports that the Russians have broken through east of this area of the breakthrough, and that Russian forces advancing from Popiv Yar and Rusin Yar and Poltavka have now almost reached the village of Sofivka and have cut the road that leads to Sofivka from the village, the town of Druzhivka, which is itself located to the north of Konstantinovka. I discussed some weeks ago in another program that there is a complex spider's web of roads and railway lines in this area, that if the Russians were to capture Dobropilia, they would be in a strong position to advance and to cut off the supply lines between Kramatorsk and Konstantinovka as well. In other words, to surround Konstantinovka in a cauldron unless the Ukrainians were to withdraw from there. And, well, if the Russians are indeed on this road between Druzhivka and Sofivka and the adjoining village of Toretsk, Goye, then the Russians have come very close to cutting another part of this spider's web of roads and railway lines. It would also mean, by the way, that Ukrainian troops who are still holding out in the villages of Shahove and Volodymyrovka, close to the base of the August breakthrough, that the Ukrainian troops in those places would in effect be cut off from resupply and would be, well, essentially surrounded. Now, again, these are reports. To repeat once more, I am not there. There's no visual confirmation of this Russian advance that I have seen. There have been many reports, though, that the Russians, over the last couple of days, have indeed been advancing in precisely this area, and it may be that they have indeed finally reached this road. In which case, as I said, these reports, which have been, well, I won't say confirmed by Western mapping projects, because a fact which many people don't seem to understand is that Western mapping projects take their information from the Ukrainians and the Russians. The only information that is coming from the battlefronts is by definition information provided by the Ukrainians and the Russians. Just saying. But anyway, these reports that the Russians have reached this place and have cut the supply road are given great credence by Western commentators and mapping projects with a good reputation for assessing this battle correctly. And as I said, if this is indeed the case, then it seems to me that we can then talk conclusively about the defeat of the Ukrainians in this area, in the Dobropilia direction, of the successful Russian consolidation of their August breakthrough, and of the likely future Russian attacks on Druzhivka, which I've just been talking about, and further west of Dobropilia as well. So anyway, important news from the Pokrovsk area and from the area to the northeast of Pokrovsk. Now, lots of things are taking place in other places. Today, for the first time, Russian reporting channels spoke about actual fighting taking place in Seversk itself. This is the fortified town to the west of the town of Slavyansk. It's a small place. Seversk is a small place. We're told by multiple commentators that the logistic supplies, the supply routes to Seversk are now almost entirely cut, that the Russians are close to capturing a village called Dronivka, which is one of the villages through which supplies have to pass in order to reach Seversk. And there's also reports that the Russians have now started an assault on the town of Liman, or rather some of the outlying villages immediately around Liman, but in effect constituting its outer suburbs. That battle is underway as well. There is some video footage that seems to corroborate some of these claims. And again, it does look as if the crisis that the Ukrainians are facing in this area, Seversk and Liman, is deepening. And, well, in Kupiansk, it seems to me that the evidence now all but conclusively confirms that the Ukrainian garrison in Kupiansk, which, according to the Russians, has been forced into a very small area, from what I can tell, a small area close to the western bank of the river Oskol, that Ukrainian garrison is now essentially trapped. There's been pictures, film, which has been shown of Ukrainian passenger cars attempting to escape Kupiansk, presumably with Ukrainian troops inside, and being immediately destroyed by Russian drones And I suspect that, as I said, essentially the Ukrainians in Kupiansk are in effect encircled. Now, there's also further information that the Russians continue to break through in the area in Zaporozhye, in Dnipro, Pokrovsk regions, that they're gradually encircling the important village of Novopavlovka, that they've broken through to a village of Vishnova, which is not far from the main supply road to the important city of Gulyapolye. But I'm not going to discuss this part of the battle in detail today. Anyway, that's the situation now. All of this is true. Then we are edging ever closer to the point when the Ukrainian defense line, the last important Ukrainian defense line in Donbass, the one made up of this line of towns, breaks, in which case the Battle of Donbass itself is within sight of its end, in which case Ukraine faces a major operational crisis. Its bargaining power in negotiations collapses because the Russians would then be in secure control of two of the four regions, Donetsk and Lugansk, the two most important of the four regions from a Russian point of view. And the Russians, of course, would be are advancing in the meantime in Zaporozhye region also. So it seems to me that the negotiating position of the Ukrainians in Istanbul or in any future discussions with the Russians, once this line of towns has fallen, their negotiating hand will have all but collapsed. They will not be in a strong position to bargain anymore. I have to say that if these two regions, if the Russians are able to clear Donbass over the course of the next few weeks or months, then I doubt that the war will end. I don't see Zelensky making serious concessions to the Russians. There might be political ructions in Kiev, but I don't believe that Zelensky is going to lose control. And, well, it could be that the crisis between the United States and Russia will then deepen, and the crisis between Russia and the West will then deepen, and there will be anger and fear and recriminations in the West at a level that we have never up to now seen. And that could be a very dangerous moment indeed in the war. Again, maybe more immediately, if we start to see Ukrainian resistance in Donbass collapse, if we start to see this row of towns start to fall, as I said in a recent program, start to fall like a row of dominoes, then on top of everything else, I am going to make a guess, this is my guess, that in that case, President Zelensky, one change he will make is that he is likely to sack General Syrskyi from his position as commander of the Ukrainian military. I think that Zelensky will almost certainly resist any and all calls to reappoint General Zaluzhny. I noticed that the founder of the Azov Brigade, a man called Belitsky, who has, by the way, no military background, no military training, I should say, rather than background, no formal military training, but who has been a tough-minded and rather ruthless commander over the course of this war and since the 2014 crisis. Anyway, I noticed that he has now been given general rank, the formal rank of a general. I wonder whether one of the changes that might come is that Zelensky, who is on good personal terms with Belitsky, might, if you were to sack Syrskyi, might decide to appoint Belitsky to his place. It would be a very eccentric decision from a certain point of view, because, as I said, Belitsky has no formal training and is not someone with experience of managing an organization like a general staff. But Belitsky is politically reliable in the sense that he has opposed all attempts to negotiate with the Russians up to now. And I suspect that in such a crisis, for Zelensky, loyalty to him and to his regime, if you like, in Kiev, will be the most paramount consideration of all. How Ukrainian society and the Ukrainian army would receive such an appointment is a completely different matter, and it's important not to speculate about something when the actual appointment of Belitsky to that post has not been made and might never be made. But anyway, I think it's something to hold back and to keep in mind. And I personally would not be surprised at all if we're starting to move in that kind of direction. Anyway, there is one final thing I do want to say before I wrap up this video, and it goes back to the topic of my previous two videos. The one that I made, the ones that I have made about President Putin's speech, the one he made at the Valdai conference, and his Q&A. And there is a narrative, there is a critique of what Putin did. Dr. Gilbert Doctorow is one person who holds it, but there are many others, that Putin was far too moderate in his language, that his comments about President Trump and about the Tomahawk missiles were so carefully phrased that they might be misinterpreted in the West. They might even be seen as an encouragement by some people in the West to escalate further on the grounds that the Russians were not reacting strongly to all the war talk and anger and hysteria that we have seen in the West, and that the situation called for a much more aggressive response from Putin than the one we actually saw. Now, I don't myself agree with that. I think that if you unpack Putin's words carefully, you will see that, as I did in my program yesterday, you will see that actually he took a very, very tough line. I don't myself see that changing the tone or the rhetoric would make much difference to the substance of what he said. And I think it's important to say that I don't think Western leaders pay much attention to what Putin says anyway. I mean, bear in mind that they don't speak Russian, so they're not listening to his words. They obtain accounts of what he said from others, mainly from the media. I suspect if Putin did speak in the very aggressive way that some people think that he ought to have done, then not only would this have been represented in the West as Putin being threatening and aggressive, and therefore being someone that it was even more important to take precautions against. But I suspect that it would have also been seen as evidence that Putin was indeed becoming rattled, that he was becoming nervous as a result of some of the things that people in the West were saying and perhaps doing. Anyway, that's my view. But the key point to make about Putin's speech and his question and answer is that it was not actually primarily addressed at Westerners at all. What was very interesting about this particular meeting is that only one Westerner who was there in attendance was able to put a question to Putin, and that happened to be, by the way, Glenn Deason, a person who I work with together with often and consider a friend, and who, unlike me, regularly attends these sessions and has been able in the past, by the way, to pose questions to Putin. And the question he posed, by the way, was the one which I've also discussed about Finland and Sweden's entry into NATO, and I've discussed in a recent program how visibly angry Putin was about that. The only moment when a genuine flash of anger appeared to come from him. But in all other respects, Westerners were basically frozen out. Chinese and Indian participants were allowed to pose questions and received extensive answers, but mostly it was the Russian media that Putin was speaking to. And of course it was to Russians that the entire speech and question and answer was broadcast. And I think that it was for Russians that the entire performance ultimately was pitched. What Putin wanted to do was to provide reassurance at a time when Russia has been called in the West a paper tiger, when the Ukrainians supposedly are winning the war, and when there was threats that Western long-range missiles would be deployed against Russia and used against it. So, given all of this, it was important for Putin to project to Russians, who of course would have been able to watch the entire speech and answers on television. It was important to project to Russians a sense of confidence, a sense of humor, a sense that Putin himself is not frightened or intimidated in any way by what the Westerners are saying and might conceivably even do, and to provide reassurance. Yes, if they supply the Tomahawks, we'll be able to deal with them like we have dealt with every other weapon the West has thrown at us, far from being a paper tiger. It is we who are advancing and who have defeated the Ukrainians, despite all the enormous flood of weapons the Ukrainians have received from the West. If the Westerners are reckless enough to seize our ships, we are friends, and this is piracy, and we're not going to be intimidated by it either, and they will simply be creating a bigger crisis for themselves. It was for Putin to project confidence and humor in a difficult situation, so that the people of Russia, and by the way, the army know that the commander-in-chief believes that the situation is not only under control, but developing in Russia's favor, and that he himself is in confident control of the whole situation. And that, in my opinion, was what the speech was intended to do, and what it did. Now, there are other things to say about the speech, and I spoke about in other programs about what a sophisticated thing Russian humor is. Westerners, in my opinion, consistently misunderstand the sophistication of Russian culture and society, which has many nuances and levels not always easily grasped by Westerners. But I'm going to give an example. Now, Putin, as I spoke in my program yesterday, mocked Emmanuel Macron, a political leader in the West, who I think he particularly detests. And he ridiculed Macron by comparing Macron to Napoleon. And of course, Putin is not the only person who has compared Macron with Napoleon. At times, Macron himself has come very close to speaking of himself as a kind of Napoleon figure. And this joke about Macron thinking of himself as Napoleon has been quite widespread in many places on media and, by the way, amongst people in France. But Putin took it further in ways that I think many people perhaps didn't notice, because of course he not only ridiculed Macron, because any comparison of Macron with the real Napoleon is ridiculous. I mean, it exposes the emptiness, the shallowness, and absurdity of Macron's personality. But Putin, throughout the entire Q&A, repeatedly reminded Russians of something which, of course, Russians know very well, which is that Napoleon was defeated in Russia. He referred to Tsar Alexander I, who was the Russian Tsar, whose armies defeated Napoleon in 1812. He referenced him on a number of occasions and drew parallels between what Alexander I had been doing and what he himself, that is to say, Putin, was doing, though Putin was very careful to make the point that Alexander was an emperor and he, Putin, is instead an elected president accountable to the people. But anyway, Putin referenced Alexander I several times. And of course, he read a poem. He actually read out an extract from a poem by Pushkin about the Battle of Borodino, when the Russian army faced off against Napoleon's army and inflicted very heavy casualties upon it outside Moscow, a battle which most Russians believe created the conditions for Napoleon's defeat in Russia in the weeks and months that followed. So here we have Putin saying, well, why should we take this jumped up pseudo-Napoleon seriously when we, in the end, actually managed to defeat the real one? Again, it's a message that many Russians will have understood. It's not perhaps always immediately apparent to Westerners. Putin not only mocked and ridiculed and exposed the nonsense of Emmanuel Macron. But he also demonstrated that Russia is strong and that it is nothing to fear from a non-entity like Macron, because the greatest military genius that Macron's country ever produced, Napoleon I, was defeated in Russia. Anyway, I'm going to finish this program at this point. Let me remind you again, you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribe Star, links under this video. Don't forget to go to our shop and see the amazing things there. And last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.